our newest guest. Hello.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Is everything like,
Yes.
yay? Okay, success.
Hello. Welcome. Please share your name, pronouns, and any other identities that you would like to share.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm James. I'm the human behind at James is Smiling, the account on Instagram and TikTok, and I'm an actor. I'm an activist. I'm an author. Three A's. I've never introduced it that way. This sounds kind of cool. I always like to say that I am a storyteller of many different mediums. So sometimes that's on stage. Sometimes that's as a writer. Sometimes that is being the platform that does my best to uplift other people's stories, whatever service I can be to the communities that I care deeply about. That's what I try to do. And I think stories are the way that we change the world. So that's what I like to do. And I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be part of this.
And we are so excited that you are part of this. Like, we're happy to have you. So I have an icebreaker to start off with.
Yeah.
So the very first one is, if you could drop everything and go anywhere right now, where would you go?
If I could drop it anywhere and go, okay, I would go to the middle of the ocean where there are whales. Probably not the middle of the ocean, maybe like kind of off the coast, because I think like thalassophobia would get the best of me and I would want to see like land. But I would want to be somewhere on the water, like by the beach where there are whales, because I think that they're magnificent creatures and I think that they're beautiful and I think we have a lot to learn from the wildlife and the marine life. And I would want that kind of like peace and serenity amidst nature and the ocean. That wasn't what I expected to say either, so I'm kind of surprised by that answer, but whales, that's what I
That's a
want.
really good answer too. I would also say the ocean, literally anywhere. I love the ocean so much. It is just beautiful and terrifying, and all the little creatures in it are so cute. And there's a lot of strength and also a lot of fragility. There's a lot of duality there.
Yeah,
Um,
also so unexplored, which does frighten me a little bit. But I think we're not supposed to know about everything out there, and I respect
no,
that. Like I respect that the ocean is supposed to be uncharted in places. Like I think that there are some places humans are not meant to go, and
really space.
parts of that are probably some of it. So,
Definitely. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started on some of the questions. Can
yeah.
you tell us a little bit more about your journey as a transgender activist and what inspired you to
Sure.
become involved in activism?
Yeah, I really think it's funny. Activist is not often the title that I use to introduce myself. I knew we'd be talking about it today, so I put that in there at the beginning. But I do think that an activist, like, I think that term is something that is bequeathed upon you by the community that you serve. And I think it's like up to the community as a whole to decide who our activists are, like, who are the people that we are entrusting with bearing the brunt of the advocacy work and bearing the brunt of furthering the movement of liberation of our community. And so I think that there are a lot of different kinds of activists, and I have a lot of respect, and I am constantly learning from and am a student of activists like Queen Jean, who runs Black Trans Liberation in New York City, activists like Raquel Willis or Alexandra Billings, you know, the women, Miss Major, like the people that paved the way before me. So sometimes I have difficulty accepting that title because I think about the folks who came before me and have been doing this work much longer than I have. And then I also am reminded sometimes by those folks themselves that like there are many lanes in which activism is crucial in order to further the trans liberation movement, and one of them is the internet. And I have been like gifted by the community with this platform of people that are listening to like what I have to say, especially about transness and about gender and about trans liberation. And that is, I consider that like a deep privilege. I don't consider it like my influencer platform. I consider it like, what is my responsibility connected to this strange megaphone that we call like TikTok and Instagram. And I also was coming up around the same time as a lot of the other like couple of trans girls that are like constantly in the media. So it was like me, Violet, Jeffrey, Dylan, like that group of us were very much in the spotlight around the same time. And by the spotlight, I mean both by like liberal and leftist communities and also by like staunch conservative anti-trans communities as well. And so sometimes by being vilified by the anti-trans community, you end up being like lauded by your actual community, and like you end up with kind of a platform that way, which I think is a little bit different than, for instance, activists like Aaron in the Morn or like Ari Drennan, like folks who are doing a lot more journalistic work on Twitter, they are definitely vilified for like their journalistic work, but they're also committed to specifically like getting us to the facts of things. Whereas my lane is a little bit different. Like I love sharing about the facts, obviously. Like I care about what's going on that way. But I started just by sharing the the most authentic version of myself that I could online. And I started way before TikTok. I started on Instagram and I started writing long captions connected to like photos about what I was experiencing and about like my feelings. And when I came out as non-binary to my close group of friends, almost immediately after that, I came out online, and that was, oh gosh, 5 or 6 years ago at this point. And that was like back when I came out as like a he they, and then obviously we have gone down the he they to they them to they she pipeline, and which I love. I mean, the stereotype really is true, and that's the trans femme journey for a lot of people, which I think is so special. And I was also talking about this in like 2018, 2019, before we had TikTok, before the pandemic, before this was like mainstream language. Like when I was talking about being a non-binary person, people had not heard of that term before. Maybe they were vaguely familiar with terms like genderqueer. Sometimes they were familiar with terms like transgender. But in my opinion and experience, there was definitely a separation between like the trans community and the non-binary community. I would say more so than there is today. Like there's definitely a striation today, but people will say the trans and non-binary community, and it rolls off the tongue much more commonly. Or when they're talking about LGBTQ people as a whole, they are including both trans and non-binary people. A lot of times when folks say, oh, trans people, they are also talking about non-binary people. So there's a lot more fluidity. Like we understand those umbrella terms to be placeholders that are encompassing everybody who is gender expansive, gender divergent, etc. And I think that that's beautiful. I think that's wonderful. But that wasn't the case when I was coming out. I was truly teaching people on Instagram like what this language meant, and I was learning it myself at the same time. I came out publicly around the same time as I started gaining a platform by talking about coming out publicly. And so a lot of my work was defining words and experiences within, the like 7 or 8 thousand followers that I had on Instagram at the time. And then as that grew and I learned more things and I started platforming more people that like knew more things, I started to gain more information, but I also started to gain access to community. And I think that's where things started to change for me a lot as well. And I think that's where I started getting involved in more of like what we would consider the activism, because I learned that people were listening to me. And I think that that has a lot to do with the fact that like I am a thin white person who speaks with a kind of authority. I speak with like what I would consider white eloquence, like the way that I have been taught by academia and like higher ed, and by like being born into a white family and like being a white person. The way that the tools that I've been offered fit right into what society expects like scholarly people to discuss. So when I discuss being non-binary with people who are like the educational elite, I seem to have like this edge to like the way that I talk about it that fits right in line with the way that they want to hear about it. And so I realized that there was this innate privilege in that, and I want to do as best I can to use that because I think it's valuable. And I do not think that trans people have to be able to speak that way. I think especially like in community with a lot of Black trans folks and trans folks of color, we should not ever have to speak that way in order to be respected. And I recognize that that's like one random angle that not random, that's one very intentional, societally defined angle that I have that is an access point. And so the more that I've used that, the more that people have like listened to what I have to say about transness, and ideally learned more about how to be open, accepting people towards the trans community. And so partially it was education work, and it was also just like sharing my story of what my transition has looked like. And I think that having positive examples of folks that like really do love their identity and really do love their transness. I know that I'm very lucky to be someone who has family support. I know that I'm lucky to be somebody who has access to community. And I know that I'm lucky to be somebody who has access to a kind of a semblance of financial stability that allows me the opportunity to get online and talk about these things. And so all of that combined kind of like got me where I am now. I've just kept talking about it. I'm very passionate about it. Like, I think that some people really are their passions just kind of fall into different categories. And one of them for me has been teaching people about gender and offering folks access points to learning about what it's like to be trans as best they can. And so I like joke that I was gifted with a lot of spoons about it, and so I want to feed as many people as possible with it. And I also don't think that that needs to ever be like a requirement. You know, like I talk to a lot of other trans folks about this, especially younger trans folks, and definitely younger trans people that are coming up in like the content creator community specifically. They're like, oh, I see folks like you and Dylan and like other people that are making a lot of content about their gender. And do I have to do that in order to be successful? And I want the answer to be no. I love sharing about my gender. Whatever horrible things people are going to say about me, I know that I can close my phone and I can very easily call up any of my friends that are also trans and find solace and community that way. And sometimes younger trans folks don't have that and they're learning how to build community. And I think it's our job as like the folks that are kind of paving the way for this on the internet specifically to be wary of that. Like I never want folks to feel that in order to be publicly trans, you also have to be an activist. I have just chosen to do that because I think that that's one of the things that I'm good at, one of the things that I am learning how to be good at as well. I don't think I'm perfect at it by any means, but it's something that I'm very passionate about, and other people just want to exist. They don't want to be passionate about that. And so I don't want them to have to take up that mantle. I am trying to do it so that other people can just exist as they are. The goal is for activists and educators like me to become obsolete. Like, we don't want to be continuing to teach people what transness is generation after generation, but I feel very lucky and like very honored that I get to make this contribution to our community. And I hope that I do us proud, because as limited as I may be in what I can share, I still want to be as effective as possible. So that's my 10-minute answer. How's
Yeah,
that?
you're good. You're good. And I think that theme of what you just said of like kind of feeling like we have to, that's something that has come up in a lot of the interviews today already.
Yeah.
And the panel talks is like feeling like we didn't necessarily want to become activists. We just
Hmm.
kind of felt the need to,
Right.
and the passion for it. And it's who we are now. And we can't really, I mean, we could change it, but I don't think any of us would. I don't think any of us would go back and do
Yeah.
anything different.
I think there's also a sense of pride that I know amongst a lot of people that like they feel there is a joy that we feel when we finally get someone to understand how to respect us a little bit better. And we know, like, okay, basic example, like you get misgendered, you correct someone, and then they're more aware of the fact that like misgendering people is a kind of violence, and then that person might be more careful when they are approaching another social situation with folks and they don't know their genders. And so like it just, I think there is a sense of pride that we can take in being able to make safer spaces that doesn't also discount how much labor is involved in that, and how like we are constantly doling out and dishing out free labor just to try to exist safely and just to make it safer for somebody else. But I also, to me, I think about it as a form of mutual aid. Like, mutual aid is one of the radical politics that I feel like has shifted the way that I approach the world, not just financially, but also in terms of the labor and energy that I expend. Like if I am going into a corporate setting and I'm teaching people about pronouns, I know that that labor is going to positively impact another trans person that will enter that space at some point inevitably. That is a deep source of pride for me. I want to be able to give back to the community that way,
Mhm.
because I feel like I've been given a lot by the community. And I think that like, I think of love as a circle and mutual aid as a circle. And so it's like whatever I'm putting out, it's not like an altruistic pay it forward. It's the way that I make rings of safety around how we exist. And so I think that there is a way that I look at it as a form of mutual aid, like a form of community care, that we do this labor, especially when it's exhausting and it's draining and it's not necessarily what we want to be doing. So yeah, I saw a question
Yeah.
that came on us to, should we acknowledge this one first, or did you want to?
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
let's go ahead and get to this one from Morgan. As a trans person, I want to get more involved in activism. What's one of the best ways to do that?
that's a great question. Also, hi, Morgan. Um, I think I think it depends on what your needs are in your community and what you feel like your capacity is. So, for some folks, digital activism is a great way to reach a lot of people. Like, that's kind of the version that I tend to do. But I started in the streets. Like, I started with protesting. And I still do that. Like, I would say that's the bedrock of my understanding of activism. The only reason I'm able to bring anything online is because of what I learn in the streets, like with other community organizers and activists that are protesting, that are organizing mutual aid, that are doing clothing swaps, that are doing like gatherings for like trans people to just exist safely in spaces, that are working at like anarchist book collectives, whatever the deal is. Those are the spaces that I feel like I learn the most about what it is to be in community and what the needs are of our community. And then I can bring that online. So I think looking at what your strengths are and what you feel like your access points into the community are is going to be best. And I think making it community specific, like if we all tried to attack this like nationwide or like on a national scale, sometimes that doesn't work. Like there are hundreds of anti-trans bills, unfortunately, circulating our legislature right now, but I can't go try to get every single one of those multi-hundreds, right? For instance, I live in the state of New York. We have fewer here than we do anywhere else, but I vote in the state of Florida because that's also like, where I grew up. It is way more effective for me to focus on what's going on in Florida because that's where my vote is. That's where I still have access to other voters and other community members, and that's where Ron DeSantis is, and famously he hates me. And so like all of that, it's true, story for another day. So I'm thinking like, Morgan is sifting through what are the ways I would get involved. I would say like truly locally, like what's your local LGBTQ center doing? What's your local health clinic doing? What are the local activists in your area doing? Are there any trans groups? Are there any like LGBTQ friendly groups that are happening? And what are the ways in which you can support those? And what are the needs of your community within that? I think that getting involved as much as you can physically in the space, as much as you're safely able to do so, is one of the best ways to get involved. And then if that's not an option, then I would say maybe look at going the digital route, or maybe look at joining any of the like online collectives there are of folks, because there are definitely ways to get involved, especially like over Zoom. Look at like the P flags in your area, the like parents and friends of lesbians and gays. A lot of times that they will have branches that are resources for trans folks. Like, it depends on what your skills are. Like your skills might be mentoring young trans people, or you might be like, I need a mentor. I need somebody who's like 5 years older than me that's done this. I need someone who's 10 years older. You might be somebody who is fantastic at like organizing a clothing swap. You might be somebody who's excellent at putting together like pamphlets about like why do we put pronouns in our signatures? Like what your skills are. And I would say, see how those can meet the needs of your community. And I always say like go community focused first, because that's where ultimately the change happens. Like we all want things to shift on a national scale, but unless we're focusing on changing the minds of like the in our communities, we can't hope to change things nationally. We have to start smaller. So hopefully that's helpful. But that's my gut reaction and my initial instinct to answer there.
Yeah. And speaking as like someone who you've been in this for a while, sorry if you hear any noise in the background. Um, um, as someone who's been in this for a while, how do you think the landscape of transgender rights and acceptance has evolved over the past like decade or so?
Yeah, it's interesting. I really do feel like it's taken a nosedive in some ways, but I also think that that's a marker of the progress. I would say I can really only speak to like the last 6 or 7 years, because before that I was in my transphobic phase. I was like part of the problem. I was quite anti-trans, which is such a classic story, right? Like how ridiculous to think that I ever sat at a table and like advocated against putting pronouns on our name tags, but I was like vehemently against it for obvious and clear reasons. Like I didn't want to put he, him, his on my name tag because it was wrong. Like, because I was having dysphoria. All that to be said, um, my involvement I think is like somewhat limited, so some of this is like built off of like a historical understanding. I'm sure you've seen circulating on the internet these videos of like trans folks that would go, especially trans women I would say, that went on television shows like in the 90s or in the 80s, and they would talk about like how they're living their life as themselves, and people were just curious about it. Like, it didn't really come from a place of judgment. And like, I think about Christine Jorgensen was named, you know, like Woman of the Year by like, I want to say multiple institutions. Someone can fact check me on that. But like, and if you don't know who Christine Jorgensen is, then you have a landing place to look at some trans history. But I think about how in the earlier days when transness was brought into collective like social consciousness, there was a lot more curiosity about it from the public eye, and it wasn't always so negative. That isn't to say that the community was without struggles, because obviously if we go back a few, you know, decades before that, we look at Star, we look at Sylvia and Marcia, we're thinking about how the pioneers of essentially the gay rights movement were transgender people that were brutalized for being transgender. So like, I'm not saying it was all sunshine and roses. In fact, it was quite awful for many people. As things started to shift into the collective, I think there was a shift, like culturally, the way that I understand it. And I think especially that was also led by a lot of like butch lesbians that were fluid between being a butch lesbian and being a trans masculine person, and by bringing transness into these spaces. And then simultaneously a lot of gay boys that were moonlighting as trans girls. And so like there's just a lot of fluidity, I think, that was happening, especially in like large metropolitan areas. And that was a way that some of them survived. It was also a way that some people thrived. And there was, I think, wider acceptance than we perhaps know about. And that all that to be said, we swing it forward now, and I think it's interesting because transness is very much at the forefront of our collective consciousness, to the point where it will likely be again one of the large, you know, hot button topics on these campaign trails as we look for like presidential campaigns. You know, like that was obviously a big argument, and in the election 2 years ago, in the primary, like it's becoming very much a big part of the American political fabric right now. And that is, I think, because we are making a lot of ground. We are gaining a lot of visibility because we are more public. There are more trans people that are active in society. Everybody knows of a trans person. I don't think that I could say that everyone knows a trans person personally. I think if everyone did, we'd actually be in a much better place. But if you live in a city, in like an urban area, you know a trans person, and you have walked down the street and you've run into one. From what I hear, especially like on TikTok and social media, from people that I'm like connected with and people in my comments, folks that live in more rural areas don't necessarily know a trans person, so they're only getting information from the media and from whatever they're being shown, either because they're actively seeking it out or because they're being shown, a slant piece, whether it's positive or negative. But I would say, like, especially if we think about Dylan Mulvaney as essentially like an A-list celebrity, you know, like Caitlyn Jenner, Chaz Bono, Laverne Cox, we have many people that are in the public eye as trans people that are at the, you know, they're Hollywood people. Hunter Schafer, like, you know, there are names that are household names that are trans, and many of them are looked at in very positive ways, which I think is wonderful. I think the people that I've named, with the exception of one, are great. And, you know, like, all that to be said, then you trickle that down, and like, you know, if you went to a high school in America, one of them's going to know me or Jeffrey or Violet. Like, people, these, like, we are then becoming names that like folks know because of the way that content creation and TikTok has been shaping this. So I've noticed that it's become quite divided. There's a lot of acceptance, especially amongst younger communities. There's a lot of expansion in the ways that they are conceptualizing their experiences of gender. Many folks are coming out as gender expansive, as trans, as non-binary much earlier than like I did. And I think that's wonderful because people are being offered role models to then contend with how they experience gender and maybe place themselves somewhere on a spectrum that feels more affirming than what they had been assigned at birth. And then at the same time, there are people that are vilifying this, and there are people that are so vehemently against it. And that's why I say it's also kind of taken a nosedive, because we're under such intense legislative and political attack. Like, we are looking at truly the beginnings of the fabric of genocide against trans people in our country, because we are legislating away children's rights to their own bodies, which is insane, in my opinion. And like, it's a social phenomenon that has been studied many times. I think if we look at the history of like abortion activism in this country, and because which is to say, let's look at the history of bodily autonomy in this country for people that aren't men, the people that aren't cis men specifically. And it has always been about control, power, and what can we do to legislate the maximum amount of control and power, and how can we push the limits of what our society deems as acceptable. And what's interesting is the abortion rights movement has been so evangelicalized, has been so pushed by this religious extremism that we've become desensitized to ideas about bodily autonomy for many folks that are legislators, for many folks that live in that are in power. And then that was like kind of the story of the 70s, was people were like, you know, they were going about the abortion rights movement, and then people got sick of hearing about it, which I think is ridiculous. Like, we should never be sick of fighting for people's bodily autonomy, but that was something that a lot of, like, you know, conservative people talked about, is like they were just so sick of hearing people talk about this, and they pushed forward this legislation because they were able to desensitize folks about it. That's very similar to what's going on today with these attacks on trans youth, is that we are using children as this moral scapegoat to push forth legislative attacks on people's bodily autonomy. And it's not going to start and end with trans youth, right? If we look at the history of this, it is the same legislators that are pushing forth anti-trans bills that are also co-signing anti-abortion bills. Like, if you look at, what is it, Idaho versus, is it Idaho versus USA? I did there's an EMTALA case that I did a TikTok video about. You can go look at it. I can't think of the name of the case. But that has a lot of like co-signers and sponsors that have also done a lot of anti-trans legislation. Like, it's not a tangled web. It's actually just kind of like a group of people. And there have been some exposés on how a lot of people that are very, very rich, like a lot of billionaires that are hoarding wealth in our country, have this anti-trans agenda. It sounds like I'm digressing, but I'm saying all of this to like show how with more visibility in our country has come the need to control it, the need to homogenize. And I think that's because this country was founded on white supremacist ideals. It was founded on the ideals of homogenization. It was founded on anti-Blackness. It was founded on anti-Indigenous racism. And we know that like Indigenous and Native communities to the Americas they had all sorts of gender expansion built into their cultures. Like, we as white people like don't have names for this. Like, we as colonizers don't have adequate language to describe the breadth of gender expansion as it existed in Native communities. And a lot of Indigenous communities don't have they don't have a record of a lot of it, because, you know, only so many things can be passed down orally, and because we have colonized them out of their history, we don't have a lot of information about this, which is horrible. And it's part of like what we have to contend with as a country. And, you know, so my point with this is it's not new. Like, we have been genociding against Native people we've been genociding against gender expansive people and Native people for as long as this country has existed. And so this is a continuation of the same pattern over and over again that says, if you don't fit in this box that white supremacy has defined as the box we need to fit in, then we will get rid of you. And that includes trans youth. And one of the best ways to enact a genocide is to go after the children. And one of the most effective ways to fearmonger people into getting on your side is by saying that children are at risk, because nobody wants children to be at risk, right? When, of course, we understand scientifically that denying children the care that they need, denying youth the opportunity to self-identify their gender and to have access to gender-affirming care, we know that's going to be detrimental to their mental health. So I know that sounds a really long answer to your question, but I think it's an important one, because like there's not many spaces to go into like the details about this. It's usually like, what's your 2-minute clip about this? But there really is a lot that goes into it. And ultimately, I think that as we have progressed a lot in society, and we have so much more space and acceptance and visibility and inclusion for trans people, it is also coming at the risk of our safety. We are hyper visible in society right now, which does not always mean that we are safe in those spaces. So I think that we are in we're a lot of activists have talked about this. We're in like an anti-BLM, an anti-trans, an anti-woke swing in our country, and I think that pendulum will swing the other way. What's that MLK quote that's like, the arc of morality is long, but it bends towards justice, like that kind of thing. I think that we will see it in our lifetime. I wonder and this sounds very morbid, but like, you know, I wonder when I leave this earth, like, what will it look like? You know, like my grandmother has been a long time abortion activist. She's like a child of the Depression. She was born in 1940 and she's still alive. And she lived through Roe v. Wade, like being passed and then like being taken away. And I think about like, what will that look like for trans activists like me? What will we look at? How will we see this be passed? What will we see taken away when we are passing this on to other generations? And as we're taking up the mantle of this struggle, you know, what are we inheriting, like in terms of rights and tools and community, but also what will we be passing along, and like what kind of world will we be handing off to the younger trans folks, you know, when I'm 80 and giving interviews still? I don't know. Like, I think about that a lot. But that's my answer.
Yeah, I was thinking about this as you were talking. I was thinking about this past Trans Day of Visibility. I saw kind of an increase in the people talking about visibility without safety is kind of really unsafe, like to put it simply. And it's not that
Yeah.
trans people don't have visibility now. It needs to be maybe morphed into a new celebration day.
Yeah.
We're very visible. I was
Yeah.
wondering, yeah, if you wanted to elaborate on that a little.
Absolutely. I think I'm gonna butcher this quote, but there's a really good quote, because I made a video about this on Trans Day of Visibility, and a lot of other trans folks expressed a very similar sentiment. And so one of the top comments, my point on this is one of the top comments is one of the actual quote, but it was the idea that visibility without safety is just a trick, you know, into like
Yes.
into jeopardizing our safety. And I think that that's quite accurate. I think that there is a twofold answer to this. One is that like trans people are visible, but I would say trans feminine people are hyper visible, and I would say a lot of trans masculine people are invisible in our society. You know, like content warning transphobic language, like for the next like 20 seconds. But there are a lot of people that look at me as like a failed woman, and then there are a lot of people that would also look at a trans masculine person as a failed woman as well. And the way that those two oppressions function is transmisogynistic, but it is different in the way that transmisogyny functions. And I think the way that it striates us is by pushing trans femmes into this hyper visible, like constantly being clocked and evaluated and adjudicated and like picked apart. And then trans masks are discarded as like not real trans people. And I mean this by like the gender criticals and the TERFs. That's what they're saying. This is obviously
Yeah,
not what I personally believe. And so,
of
and
course
nor
not.
yeah, nor would I ever endorse this logic. Okay, content warning over. Back into the idea behind this is that we do have a lot of visibility. I think that because of this like anti-trans wave of legislation, the visibility is not always responsible visibility. And so sometimes people will cherry pick trans folks, they will manipulate our words, they will manipulate what trans liberation is all about in order to fit their political agenda. And that is not fair to the movement. It's not in good faith. And it's also like visibility without consideration for what the needs of the community are, like what are the ways to push us further towards the center and away from the margins, is not a good faith visibility gesture. You know, like anything that's not sustainable action towards making us safer in all spaces is just cherry picking and tokenizing us for the purposes of like appeasing a liberal agenda. And to me, that's so deeply uninteresting because we're just being taken advantage of again. And I do think that we are quite visible. And I said that we actually don't need any more visibility. There were people that disagreed with me and said that in rural communities, there still does need to be more visibility. And I'm not going to argue that because I can't speak to that. I don't live in a rural community. And so I'm willing to like check my privilege on that and say that is a very possible thing that I may be not qualified to speak on. I would say overall in like in our country today, we are aware that trans people exist and we are a hot topic item. The majority of people on the street will have heard of trans people, whereas like 15 years ago, I don't think that that really would have been the case.
Mm.
And so I think that the visibility is just not as interesting to me anymore unless it's coming with actual safety measures. I want more visibility on the ways in which cisgender people are showing up for us. I want more visibility on the ways in which we're being marginalized by not only the culture that we've shaped, everything from like binary bathrooms to anti-trans legislature to, you know, like the school district on Long Island voting against letting trans women play sports. You know, like I want visibility on the ways in which trans people are being used as scapegoats to desensitize us to issues of bodily autonomy. I want more visibility on the connection between cis women and trans women being maligned by the same kind of patriarchy. I want more visibility on the ways in which cis people need to be showing up for us, because trans people didn't create transphobia, cis people did. So I want more visibility on how that's functioning and how cis people are taking up the mantle of that responsibility. I don't really care about like being reposted an infographic about what pronouns are. Like, either somebody's going to go figure that out or they're not. Either somebody's going to be committed to this or they're not. Like, we're kind of at that stage where we have to progress, and we have to be pushing. If we're pushing for liberation, liberation is not pronouns in an email signature. Liberation is, have we shifted the scales of justice to make sure that trans people aren't being fired for being trans, to make sure that people aren't being homeless, being forced to be homeless because they're trans? Are we caring for trans sex workers, and are we figuring out ways in which we can be engaging in mutual aid in ways to like help the trans folks that are living on the margin of society, especially how, you know, transphobia disproportionately affects Black trans women and trans women of color? Do we have visibility on those issues? That's more what I'm interested in. But I am also fed up with like the liberal pandering to like, look, you know, we did Trans Visibility Day and we highlighted the one he, they that works in our office. And it's like, actually, you probably just ostracized them more than you have helped them, you know? And I think it comes down to, oh, I'm on my soapbox now. I think it comes down to the fact that like people always want to do the right thing, and liberalism. Asada Shakur says this, and this is like an idea that she says that I'm going to take and move further with it. The liberalism tells us that we can just kind of slap a nice pride flag on stuff and be like, I did my allyship work for the day. Whereas investment in liberation says this is a lifelong investment, and this is something that it requires continuous commitment. Like, it is not something that can be a one-off action. So like the idea that visibility, like we can just dedicate a day to like fixing all the issues of transness, is the same thing as saying like, oh, if we just do Black History Month, then we'll eradicate racism. And every anti-racism educator will say we need a lot more than a month, but it's helpful to have it maybe if it's used in a way that is constructive. And I would say the same thing about Trans Day of Visibility, or like, you know, how we have that week in November. I would say that if those are used constructively, they can be great tools, but they have to be used constructively and in good faith and with tangible action steps attached to them.
Yeah, that actually goes right into this another comment from Morgan, who asked, "What can we or our allies do to keep the narrative out of the conservatives' hands?" That's a really good question.
Yeah, Morgan, this is a great question. I think trans people are not often the ones that are most at risk, right? Like, we intercommunity wise, we're not really at risk of like shaping our own narrative by conservatives. Like, if you ask another trans person how they learned they were trans, it wasn't from Tucker Carlson. It wasn't from high, right? They learned
Yeah.
they knew another they them, and they're like, wait, I think I'm kind of like you. So I would say intercommunity wise, we're pretty taken care of. We lean on each other, and people know generally where to go to find resources. We can always use more. But I think that the way that we can take it out of conservatives' hands, like in terms of mainstream media, is by challenging cis people to go back to primary sources. When you hear some cis person say something about trans people, say, where did you hear that from? What trans person specifically did you hear that from? You know, like, I think one of the ways that we look at anti-oppression as it functions is by letting communities rewrite their own narratives and by letting them be in control of them, right? So it's like, we don't want to teach whitewashed history in our classes. If we want to learn about Native American history, we need to learn it from Native Americans. If we want to learn about Black history in this country, we need to learn it from Black people. If we want to learn about what it is to be disabled in our country, and we want to learn about how the medical model of disability functions, we need to learn from disabled people. So same thing with transness. It's like, if we want to learn about trans people, or if we want to learn about transness, go to trans people. And so I think it's challenging cisgender folks to check their sources and who they're challenging them to find who their educators are, and always refocusing on listening to folks within the community, because conservatives are never going to do that. And if they do, they're going to cherry pick the Caitlyn Jenners and the Kelly Cadigans of the world, and the pick-me's are never going to be the ones that can dominate the overall narrative, because that's why they're the pick-me's. It's like an offshoot, you know? It's like there's always going to be a zillion folks like me in comparison to the amount of like Kelly Cadigans there are and Candace Owenses. You know what I mean? Like, and the list kind of goes on. You can name an oppression, and there's a Fox News cherry pick version of it. There's a pick-me on Fox News. And so I think that really focusing on trans folks as our primary sources and honoring the way that we are shaping our culture and telling our history and how we are putting our identities forward is the best way to keep it out of conservatives, because it's very rare that you're going to get a trans conservative. So that's my thought.
Definitely rare. Yeah, and I think I agree with everything you're saying, and I think that theme comes up a ton in some of our later discussions today as well, of like, and my brain farted. I lost it. I lost the thought, but essentially what you were talking about, yeah, I'm gonna move on because my brain's not coming back to that. We do get another question from Morgan. Do you have any good sources you like to recommend to people that are large sources?
I think it depends on what kind of sources folks take to the best. You know, like if they're folks that like books, for instance, then I would look at some of our leading trans authors. Like I would look at Jacob Tabaya, who wrote Sissy, a fantastic book about what it's like to be non-binary. I would look at Miss Major wrote a book. I would look at Cecilia Gentili wrote a book. I would look at, I mean, truly, you can go through like the Lambda Literary Awards for like transgender nonfiction, and you can kind of learn about people's identities for years and years to come. But I would also say that like there needs to be a balance between learning trans history and also learning about like transness from a personal perspective. There are tons of podcasts about transness. Of course, in this moment, I'm like, I can't think of one, and I'll think of like 8 as soon as this ends. But I think that like having them go to primary sources is a really good one. Also pointing them towards things like our activists at ACLU, like thinking about like what Chase Strangio is doing, and like looking at what the ACLU like trans blogs are doing and the way that they are chronicling things. Like that is trans people doing this work. Look at Aaron and the Moore and Substack. That is trans people doing this work. Like going to primary sources about this, I think is going to be the best way. So those are some of the ones that I would use. But I also say to just like flood your feed on social media with as many trans people as you can. Like find a bunch of trans activists. Like I have tons of highlights linking a bunch of trans activists. I've got tons of posts about it, and I'm not the only one who does. Like, excuse me, I'm one of many trans folks that are like dedicated to circulating the words of like our community. And so I think that going to those primary sources and finding whatever media you use most, and then incorporating trans people into that. So whether that's social media, whether that's podcasts, audiobooks, physical books, whether that is TV shows, things like that. Like, what are the ways in which we are, you know, look at Disclosure. There are so many people that are, and, you know, I have my critiques of the Disclosure documentary, but it's absolutely revolutionary for like its time, and it's crucial. And there are so many springboard jumping off points, you know, like people will just be like, oh, I watched Disclosure and Paris is burning and now I know everything. And it's like, oh my gosh, I need you to know the history behind these as well. I need you to take all of the people and the names that are mentioned in this and look at each one of them and see, because there's no way you know all of them, because I don't. I'm still learning. Like, I don't know everything. And I think that using each of those as springboards to learn more about things is going to be really useful. So whatever the source, whatever the kind of media they like to consume is, incorporate trans people into those sources, because that's going to be easier than trying to get them to go another direction on something that they may be only tangentially interested in.
Yeah, I actually did, while you were speaking, remember what I was going to mention over the other thing. You were talking about how you need to go to a trans person to get information about trans people. And something that comes up in conversations later today is that we Yes, absolutely. That would be the absolute best way to do it. But some people are not going to listen to people who don't look like them.
Yeah.
And so, what's one way you think maybe we could address that? Because, I mean, a cis person who is so anti trans is not going to listen to a trans person because they're going to believe they're biased, which is really funny to think about. But like that's just how the conversations go. They're like, oh, they're biased because they are trans. That's why they believe this way. It's like, well, actually, they have the lived experience. So that's like one of the most important parts about this topic. But yeah.
Absolutely. I'm going to relate this to the way that I like talk to people about anti-racism, and I want to give like the caveat that I understand that race and race and gender are not the same thing. They do not function the same way. But the way that like I understand being an ally is obviously not to transness, you know what I mean? So like I'm going to frame it under something slightly different. So like what I have found is that a lot of folks when I share something about anti-racism on Instagram because I've like reposted somebody else's story or I reference, you know, like a writer, I reference somebody in a reel, someone's always like, oh, I didn't know who that person was. Let me go look it up. And I also am deeply aware that the reason they listened to me was because I was white and because I looked like them and because they're like, wait, nobody wants to be left out. People have ridiculous amounts of FOMO. And so if I'm coming and quoting bell hooks and they're like, well, why do you know something that I don't know? Why does this person have this information? I don't, who's Angela Davis? You know what I mean? Like, and so then all of a sudden they become more interested in it because like I, as the person with privilege in this particular scenario, have set the bar of what we are supposed to be knowing. And so sometimes the people who hold the power have to set the standards and kind of use white supremacy to our advantage and use that kind of competitive nature that we have, especially amongst like white cis people, about like who knows the best and who can be the best ally and who knows the most and who's the most woke, whatever. And so I think that that can be used to our advantage. And I find that my job then becomes like as the white person who named the like anti-racism talking point and source to the person is to then say, I can't be the one that answers every question they have about it. I have to be like, oh, you should actually go read this bell hooks, you know, book. You should actually go read this book by Angela Davis, this speech by Angela Davis, and like learn from these people specifically. You should read Michelle Alexander's book. You know, like don't take my word for it because like I may not be a reliable source. Go to the actual one. But if I bolstered them with credibility, then they're more likely to go listen to those folks, even though they may be racist, right? I think that it's very similar with gender in terms of the way that allyship can function. And so I think it does sometimes take an educated ally, especially like somebody who might be in the LGBTQ community that is like around trans folks a lot, like, you know, like a passing gay person, essentially. Like those can be really are great allies. I tell this to gay men all the time, especially gay men that like can code as straight in public settings. I'm like, you can be the best allies to the trans community. You have no idea what kind of privilege and access you have that, just like you were saying, we don't get as trans people because we are not deemed worthy at all. But if you set that bar and that standard to like start kind of talking about something and bring up a point and be like, oh, well, I learned it from this person, you don't even have to say that they're trans necessarily. That might be something that, you know, they don't read the back of the book cover, they don't look at who's running this podcast until it's too late, until they bought into the intelligence, until they bought into, you know, listening to that person. So I think it's about cis people understanding how to use their allyship effectively to be switchboard operators to the trans community. So it's like, yes, you might be the point of contact. Your job is to get them on board and then shift them over to believing us, because ultimately, like, the goal is to get them there, right? And I think that it is very much true that there are people who are not going to listen to folks that don't listen to them, which is why it's crucial that allies are educated. And so it's like, I want my words to come out of cis allies' mouths in order to get them back to me, in order to get them back to our other trans leaders in this movement that have been doing this longer than I have, in order to get to Black trans women, in order to get to trans women of color, in order to get to trans women that are sex workers, in order to get to trans women that are disabled. The list goes on, right? So, you know, that's the way that I think about it. Is it perfect? No, but I do think that it is very effective, especially when we're talking to like moderate political white people, right? Like, which is the swing voters. Like when we're talking about like the group that is ultimately going to decide whether we get rights, like that's going to be a really crucial way to get through to them. And like, I don't like that. I wish that we respected other people enough to listen to them, but that's not always the truth. You're very right. It's like we can't always be the primary source because they have too much transphobia to unlearn. And so part of unlearning it is being our our voice for a moment until you can get them to come over to us.
Yeah. And we are just about at time, so I just want to ask, what's coming up for you? What are we looking forward to in the coming days, weeks, months?
Yeah. Right now, there's a couple of projects that I like wish I could announce that I don't know if they're going to be finalized. So like maybe really cool stuff is going to happen, and maybe it won't, because that's like how theater works. So like hopefully I land one of these projects that I've been in for that I would really love to do. It's been a wild like audition season as an actor. Like there have been some projects that I have been so excited to go in for because they've been really trans affirming and exciting teams, than other ones that had so much promise that really let me down. But as always, I, like every other trans actor, am hoping to end up in a really affirming, trans-friendly space that allows me to be who I am. So hopefully I'll be able to like tell you in the next few weeks that I am going to be doing one of those things, but that's always up in the air. At the same time as like doing all the acting stuff, I'm writing my first book, which I'm really excited about. That won't be within the next few weeks or months for like everyone, but it will be for me because I'm gonna have to keep writing it. So my like debut memoir is called "Sorry I Keep Crying During Sex," and it's gonna be about. It is about. I've written most of it. About healing from sexual violence while my grandfather was dying of Alzheimer's as I'm transitioning genders, and it's like an exploration of what does losing your mind look like, you know, while you're trying to gain it back, while you're going through trauma therapy. And it's about grief, insanity, and survivorship, and dark humor. And so that's what we have to look forward to. Is like I'm going to be doing that, and which is a really wonderful, exciting journey. I've always wanted to write a book, and I'm really excited about this. So like, you know, a trans win is out there. I'm really excited to be like one of the, if not the first trans person on like this particular roster at this agency. I'm not sure. I got to fact check that. But certainly one of, you know, hoping to help knock through one glass ceiling to drag through a whole bunch of other dolls with me, you know? But that's exciting. And so like knowing that I will hopefully be one of many voices in media, that's like a voice that will, you know, a book sits on a shelf longer than I'm going to be able to give interviews, right? So like that will hopefully live on longer than me. And this first one is not going to be like the trans manifesto. It's about like, it's what I need to write for like me personally. And it feels very beautiful to not have to have a story that is solely about transness, that is also about many other lived experiences that I have that are informed by my transness. But I didn't want to write the transifesto. You know what I mean? Like, not yet. I also don't think I'm super qualified for that. I think that would have to be like an anthology of many writers that are not just my voice. But that's what I'm really excited about. And I'm going to continue doing stuff online on the internet, because I love being on social media. I love being on Instagram and TikTok. And so, you know, whatever chaos I end up doing over there, but I'm excited writing the book. And I'm also going to be visiting my family soon. And I know that's not like a major exciting thing for like the general public, but it's exciting for me because I love my family and I haven't gotten to see them in a minute. So that's fun and cool. So like those are my wins, I guess, that are coming up. Um,
Absolutely.
all super public and exciting, but little wins are good.
Definitely. And what platforms can the audience find you on if they want to look more into your book or your
Yeah.
acting and all of your other things that you have going on?
Yeah, I'm on TikTok and Instagram and Threads as at James is Smiling. That's all I'm on though. If you're like, if you find something else, like, well, I'm on like Grinder, but like, don't find me there. Uh, like, and there have been many catfishes, which I'm honored by. There should be more. But those are the places that you can find me. Instagram is best. Like I can check my DMs on Instagram way better than TikTok just because the platform is more manageable. But also if you're ever trying to get like directly in contact with me about like mutual aid efforts or like just anything that you want to connect with me on, my email, which is in my bio, it's hello@jamesissmiling.com, is also a great way to connect with me. It's how Robin and I got connected. It's how I'm supporting California Aggregate for gender diversity today, which I'm so excited to be doing. So those are the ways to find me. But TikTok, Instagram, Threads, and my email, my inbox, my DMs. On the
Okay,
street,
well,
the train, like hiding behind my sunglasses. Come like say hi to me. I'm hiding, but I also like always have minutes to say hi to someone. So
I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining today. We're so happy. I'm so happy that I got to talk to you. We're so happy as a team that you were able to join us.
oh my gosh.
Um,
Truly.
This has been fun.
Thanks for letting me like talk your ear off for like an hour straight. I so appreciate the opportunity to like have this space. It's so rare to like get that, and I'm really excited to be supporting what you're doing. I think it's really, really awesome. And when I get out to California eventually, I want to come see it.
Absolutely. We want you to come see it.
Yeah.
Whenever we also have a building. So maybe they'll line up around the same time. For sure. All right. Well, thank you so much. And
Um,
we'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
Thank you so much. Bye.